What if the exhaustion, emotional heaviness, restlessness, and desire for change that you have felt since March weren't random? What if there was actually a progression to it? Looking back at the lunar cycle since the spring equinox, I think there is. Nothing that's necessarily bad, nothing that's necessarily good, just different. Maybe you felt exhausted. Maybe you felt emotional. Maybe you wanted change, but you couldn't seem to get moving. Or maybe you started making changes, but suddenly found yourself overwhelmed by feelings that you thought you had already dealt with. If any of that sounds familiar, I want to offer a different perspective. What if the first quarter of 2026 wasn't random? What if there has actually been a progression to what we've been experiencing emotionally? Not because the moon controls us, not because we are victims of astrology, but because lunar cycles often reflect patterns that are already moving beneath the surface of our lives. And when I look back at the first quarter of this lunar year, I see a very clear progression, one that mirrors how healing unfolds in the nervous system. So let's start in March. March carried a very different energy than the energy we are in right now. We were coming out of Pisces season. Pisces is associated with ending, surrender, emotion, and release. And honestly, I think a lot of people were tired. Not lazy, not unmotivated, just tired. Emotionally tired, mentally tired, spiritually tired. And many people were carrying exhaustion that they hadn't fully acknowledged and still haven't. Pisces has a way of slowing things down enough that you finally have to feel what you've been avoiding. And then we reach the spring equinox, that energetic beginning of a collective new cycle. But here's something important. The body doesn't always trust new beginnings immediately. The mind might say, I'm ready. But the nervous system might say, are we sure? And that gap matters. Then our Aries energy arrived, right? Suddenly there's movement, motivation, action, momentum, at least in theory, right? Because for many people, it didn't feel inspiring. It felt uncomfortable. Because Aries asks, who are you becoming? And that's not always an easy question, especially when your nervous system still associates change with uncertainty. Many people discovered that visibility just felt too vulnerable. Action felt too risky. Growth was uncomfortable, and moving forward may have activated fear. Not because anything is wrong with them, but the nervous system often remembers experiences long after the conscious mind believes it's moved past them. Then we get to April, which brought an important shift. The Libra full moon shook up Aries energy to expose imbalances. Many people began to notice places in their lives where they maintained external peace while feeling disconnected internally. And maybe you've experienced that for yourself, being the helper, the caretaker, the people pleaser, the peacemaker, and suddenly realizing I am taking care of everyone except me. Libra asked, how can I stay connected without abandoning myself? And then Taurus arrived. Taurus slows everything down. Taurus wasn't asking us to become more productive. It was asking what actually supports you, what exhausts you, what feels sustainable, and what helps you feel safe. And for many people, that last question especially is a very radical one, because we're often taught to push through, override our own needs, ignore exhaustion, force outcomes. Taurus reminded us that healing isn't just happening in the mind. It has to happen in the body as well. And then came the Scorpio full moon to shake up Taurus energy. Scorpio rarely asks permission for anything. It exposes things. It shines light into places where we would rather not look. Our fears, old wounds, emotional patterns, limiting beliefs, protective behaviors. And this is where many people discovered something important. The desire for change isn't always the problem. Sometimes the nervous system simply doesn't feel safe enough to hold the change yet. Scorpio asks, what truths have you been avoiding? What wound is still influencing your daily choices? What fear is still running quietly in the background? Those aren't comfortable questions, but they are powerful ones. And this brings us to where we are now. We're in Gemini season, the first true expansion point of the lunar year. After months of feeling, of moving, of balancing and grounding and facing difficult truths, Gemini asks us to understand, to gather perspective, shift it if necessary, because being curious to look at your own patterns, ask yourself, what story am I telling myself? What keeps repeating? Am I seeking information, or am I avoiding clarity? And that understanding prepares us for the upcoming Sagittarius full moon, because Sagittarius isn't just about freedom. It's about meaning. It's about asking, what truth expands me instead of exhausting me? What belief am I ready to outgrow? What future becomes possible if I stop shrinking myself to survive? Full moons introduce conflict, not to harm you, but to help you avoid ending up in a rut. So if under this full moon you discover what's exhausting you, what you've outgrown, and ways that you shrink to survive, then you have to do something with that awareness. That's the conflict. That's the tension. Awareness is knowing what you need to change. And that change is rarely easy because it may involve other people. The very people you may shrink around. And now you have to create a boundary that protects you, not them. So as we move deeper into Gemini and then Cancer and Leo energy, the lessons change. The first quarter was about awareness. The second quarter becomes about embodiment, living what you've learned. And not just understanding your patterns, but changing them. Not just identifying wounds, but building something beyond them. Not just doing the work, but living the work. And honestly, that's where healing becomes difficult because awareness feels meaningful, but embodiment feels vulnerable. It's one thing to know what needs to change, but it's a completely other thing to actually live differently. So the question is no longer, what am I healing from? In this next quarter, this next season, the question becomes, what am I ready to build now? Because healing wasn't meant to keep us trapped in some endless loop of self-analysis. Eventually healing asks us to live. The first quarter may have taught many of us how to listen to ourselves again. And the second quarter may teach us how to trust what we heard. If this resonates with you, I'd love to hear your experience in the comments. And if you are interested in learning more about healing through lunar cycles, nervous system awareness, and emotional healing, make sure that you subscribe. And you can visit my website, wildmoonhealers.com, for more information. Until next time.